Today, Elijah Cole from Caltech will tell us what to do with the limited, noisy, and weak supervision often found in real-world settings. This is RISE Learning Machines Seminars. RISE is Sweden's research institute with nearly 3,000 people working on a wide array of topics. The computer science department works on applied AI projects for the benefit of society, and we organize these weekly Learning Machines seminars. The meeting will be recorded, and if you want to be removed from this recording, just let us know. You can, for example, drop me an email afterwards. Also, make sure to check out the collection of great talks that we have on our YouTube channel. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce Elijah Cole, who is a PhD candidate at Caltech, advised by Pietro Perona. And I think he's located in Los Angeles, which makes him 9 hours before us, after us, which sort of means that we're very happy that he got up at 6 o'clock in the morning to give this talk today. Elijah has had internships at Google Research, Microsoft AI for Earth, and the Air Force Research Laboratory during his PhD studies. His research focuses on deep learning and computer vision, emphasizing the learning from limited, noisy, and weak supervision. And the topic today is learning from real-world data. And with that said, I'll hand over to you, Elijah.
Okay, let's get the slides going. Okay, great. Thank you for that introduction. And so feel free to interrupt for questions anytime. Happy to take them as they come. So my name is Elijah Cole, or Eli, and I'm going to tell you about some of our research that's focused on this intersection between what we do in mainstream machine learning and the constraints we run into when we look at real-world applied problems. And so to start off with, humans collect just a ton of data. So every year we collect about 3.6 billion diagnostic X-rays. The community science project eBird collected about 150 million bird sightings in 2020. And in terms of Earth observation imagery, we collect over 100 terabytes a day. So huge, huge amounts of data. And we do this because we hope to be able to make progress on societal problems in medicine and sustainability, things like this. And so all of this data is potentially transformative, but only if we can find ways to make sense of this data. And so the typical process for getting from raw data to some kind of scientific or technical insight is to first extract the important information from the data. And so we call this annotation, where an expert looks over raw data and applies labels that capture the important information about that data. In the second stage, another human will look over the labeled data and come up with some kind of an interpretation that leads to a new insight in their field. So for instance, in the context of remote sensing, we may have a bunch of patches of satellite imagery. And in each one, we have a binary label, true or false, for whether there is cropland shown in the image. This would be the annotation phase. In the interpretation phase, someone would look over all this data and draw a conclusion like cropland area in Utah has increased by 5% this year. The problem is that we have way too much data to annotate. This first stage is too slow, where we go from the raw data to the labeled data. We'd like to be able to use AI systems to help, because once they're trained, they can review data very quickly. But the problem is that we still need labeled data to train the AI system in the first place. Now, this is hopefully a one-time cost, where we'll label data one time, train up our AI system, and then it will be able to automatically annotate data in the future. But we still need to overcome that one-time cost, and it's often quite expensive. And so we're left in the same boat as we were before, where we have too much data to annotate to get this process started. And so we'd like to be able to use AI to help with real-world problems, but to do this in the first place, we need labels, which are costly. The traditional perspective of the machine learning community is to say, okay, well, let's develop our AI algorithms using these standard benchmark data sets for which we already have lots of labels. And then we're going to hope that our findings apply to real-world problems. And consequently, as a field, we tend to focus quite heavily on standard benchmark data sets. We invest most of our effort in these standard benchmarks and relatively little effort as a field in what I would call real-world problems. And so an example of one of these standard benchmark data sets that we focus on is ImageNet, which is a data set of everyday object categories, 1,000 categories, 1,000 images per category. And so you wind up with about 1 million images. And so ImageNet has been arguably the gold standard of the computer vision field for the last decade. And we've made a lot of progress on ImageNet. This is a plot from the website Papers with Code that tracks the performance of different algorithms for different papers on data sets. And as a function of time, you can see the blue curve is the state of the art, how well the best performing algorithm does in ImageNet. And so these days we have algorithms that can get over 90% accuracy on this large data set, which is a big deal. This is would have been unthinkable 5 or 6 years ago. But if we've made all this progress, then why don't we have these sort of reliable automatic data analysis systems that we need for applications in science and medicine? I claim the answer is that the standard benchmark data sets tend to lack certain real-world properties that make them poor models for doing this research if we want it to translate to these scientific use cases. So for example, ImageNet has very visually distinctive classes. But in sustainability, we're often interested in species recognition or things like that, where the categories are extremely fine-grained. The distinctions between different categories are very subtle. ImageNet also has lots of labeled data for every category. Remember 1,000 images per category. But this is not representative of what happens in medicine, where, and for most conditions and most subtypes, you'll have a handful of labeled instances per category. Not 1,000 is not even close. And we also tend to treat images as completely divorced from their context. We just have the image and the label, and that's it. But you can imagine cases like digital humanities where you have an image and you actually know a lot about that image. You know the year, you know the artist. And so it wouldn't make much sense to learn from this data without incorporating this rich metadata that you have access to that characterizes the images. And so we wind up with this realism gap where progress on these standard benchmark data sets is not necessarily translating to progress on important real-world problems we want to solve. And my goal here is to convince you that we should actually shift this curve, that we should spend more of our research effort on problems of greater realism. And I'm going to claim that there are two benefits to this. One is that there will be greater real-world impact of our work. If we're working on problems that are already more realistic, then it's less of a hurdle to translate them to systems that function in the application domains. And two, I actually think working on real-world problems is a really great way to make new discoveries in machine learning, new fundamental progress in machine learning. And so I'll argue for both of these throughout the talk. And so how can we do this? I tend to work on what I would call full stack AI research. And by that, I mean starting from collaborating with domain experts to identify the goals of their domain and their data constraints and figure out what the blockers are. What are the features of their problem that prevent it from being solved by currently available methods. And once we have the blockers, we can build benchmarks that capture progress against those blockers. And once we have a benchmark data set, we can do what the machine learning community does very well, which is to rapidly iterate on the benchmark data set and develop new algorithms for solving this problem. Then once we have an algorithm, we can hand it over to domain experts and have them use it to accelerate their scientific or medical work. And the hope is that these machine learning systems will facilitate progress towards the domain goals in the first place. And at the same time, each of these steps has lessons that we can take and generalize to make fundamental improvements in machine learning. And so we'll see examples of both of these where we've built systems that are functional tools for domain experts, as well as written papers that lead to new insights for machine learning people. And so these are a few of the projects and benchmarks that I've worked on throughout my PhD. They cover, many different areas and modalities, but they tend to focus in sustainability applications, which is a really great area for machine learning research right now. And so some of these benchmarks are important because they are revealing new research opportunities for mainstream machine learners. And some of them are important because they're actually driving product experiences for hundreds of thousands of people in domains like the community science platform iNaturalist. Before we can get to any of that, we're going to do a brief overview of, what do we mean by these machine learning terms, and what does it mean to learn from data? So I'll pause for just a second, both for coffee and for questions. If there are no questions, I will move on. So machine learning, by this, we just mean using data to build algorithms that can automatically answer questions. And by computer vision, we actually mean the same thing. It's just that the questions pertain to images in particular instead of being about arbitrary data objects. And so the prototypical computer vision problem is image classification. And so, for instance, given this image, we may ask the question, is this a truck or is this a car? And it's hard to come up with a rule for this based on raw pixel values, right? Because what is it about different colors or different patterns of colors that make something a car? And so the way we solve this instead is with a pipeline that looks like this, where we start with an image, we pass it through some kind of a model, and it's often a convolutional neural network in computer vision. And that model makes some prediction. Maybe it predicts this is a truck. And so the way we train these systems is that we have the image, it passes through the model and results in a prediction. At the same time, we have a human who has looked at the image and come up with a ground truth label for whether it's true or false, whether it's a truck or a car. And then we have a loss function that takes the prediction and the label and tells us how wrong we are and tells us how to update the model's parameters so we make a better prediction next time. And so this is the training process in a nutshell, and we just repeat this with many, many images and many, many labels until we're happy with the performance of our classifier. And so we can think of the model as a two-stage object. In the first stage, we have a feature extractor whose goal is to compress the image into a useful vector. So the image is this big high-dimensional object. It's hard to work with. And the job of the feature extractor is to take the image and compress it into some kind of a relatively small vector that captures just the important information about the image. And then the second stage is a classifier that will assign this vector to some category decision. And representation learning is the solution to many computer vision problems these days. And it's this process of finding a way to transform complex data into features that are easier to analyze. So instead of writing down a rule based on raw pixel values, we're using data to learn an image classifier that can take the image and make the right decision without having to explicitly write down the rule for what makes a car or a truck a truck. And so I would say that we actually know how to solve many specific computer vision problems if we have lots of labeled data. This representation learning framework has been extremely successful. That's how we've made this progress in ImageNet. But the crucial thing it depends on is having lots and lots of labeled data. But what happens if we don't have a lot of labeled data? So remember our decomposition of the model into a feature extractor and a linear classifier. The problem is that we need a lot of labeled data to learn both of these objects. And it would be lovely if we could learn a feature extractor without using any labeled data. And this is the goal of self-supervised learning. So in self-supervised learning, the first stage is to learn a feature extractor without using any labeled data. And the second stage is the same, and hopefully you can use just a few labels to train a classifier on top of the feature extractor. And our goal here is to obtain a good classifier using fewer labels. Right, and this is useful, you can imagine, in any domain where labels are expensive, in medicine or ecology, you'd like to be able to minimize the amount of labels you have to acquire before you can get a well-performing system. Excuse me. And so the pipeline here is very similar to the pipeline for supervised learning that we saw before. except that the ground truth label, this orange box, instead of coming from a human looking at the image, is a pseudo label that is based on the image itself. And we'll see some examples of what I mean by this. And self-supervised learning is everywhere. If you've been following kind of machine learning news lately, you've probably heard of a lot of applications of this in vision and language, but we're just going to focus on vision for the purposes of this talk. And so one example of a self-supervised learning system is rotation prediction. The idea with this method is that you take an image, you rotate it by a random amount, 90 degrees, 180, or 270, and then you ask your model to predict, okay, how much did I rotate this image? And you know that answer because you're the one who rotated the image in the first place. And so the idea is that, look, if the model can accurately tell me how much I rotated this image, it must know something about the categories that are shown in the image, right? You need to know the difference between the top and the bottom of a bird to be able to predict how much I've rotated an image of a bird. And so this is the intuition behind rotation prediction as a self-supervised algorithm. You could also imagine you take an image and you mask out a big chunk of the pixels, and you ask your model to fill in the blanks. And the idea here is that if the model is able to do this, then it must be learning something about the semantics of the data, about how these images tend to be structured. A more popular recent paradigm is called instance discrimination. And so in this case, you take an image, you apply two different transformations to the image, and these are typically randomized transformations that will involve some cropping, some color jittering, things like this. So you have these two different views of the same image. You pass them through a CNN to get a representation of the images. And then you take representations of the same image and you push them together. And you take representations of other images and you push them away. So we have an image, we apply two different augmentations or two different transformations to this image. We get embeddings for those images. And if the views come from the same parent image, we pull them together. And if the views come from different parent images, we push them apart. And so this is the basic idea behind instance discrimination, and SimCLR is one of the canonical examples of an instance discrimination self-supervised method. And self-supervised learning has made very rapid progress over the last 5 years or so. And today there are self-supervised methods that can actually produce better feature extractors than if you had done supervised learning in the first place, which is a big deal. And there's plenty of other methods that are only 1 or 2% behind, which is, for most use cases, is comparable and is good news. The problem is that most papers in self-supervised learning only use ImageNet for pre-training. For the pre-training, meaning the stage where you learn the feature extractor. And so you might wonder, okay, well, what if I'm working in a domain like medicine or like ecology that doesn't actually look that much like ImageNet? What do we need to know if we want to use a different data set for self-supervised learning? And when should we expect self-supervised learning to provide significant benefits? And so this is the problem we take up in our 2022 paper called When Does Contrastive Visual Representation Learning Work? And we're trying to understand the necessary conditions for self-supervised learning to succeed. It may not be obvious, but self-supervised learning is actually a very expensive process. So for instance, training SimCLR one time on ImageNet costs around $2,000. So by the time you are training this multiple times, you're tuning parameters, you could wind up spending tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars on training. And so it's important to know ahead of time when you should expect self-supervised learning to help you out at all. And so to get at this, we study self-supervised learning across different domains. So we do use ImageNet, but we also study INAT21, which is a data set we built that I'll talk about in just a minute. We look at Places 365, which is a data set of images that are scenes instead of being focused on objects like ImageNet. And we also look at GeoLife Clay 2020, which is a data set we put together that is satellite imaging or aerial imaging in the United States and France. And so the hope is that by studying self-supervised learning across these different domains, we can begin to get a sense for what are the aspects of self-supervised learning, what do we know about self-supervised learning in general, as opposed to what do we know about self-supervised learning on ImageNet, where most of these papers tend to focus. And so for the talk, we're just going to focus on ImageNet and INAT21. And so I've mentioned iNaturalist. This is a community science project based at the California Academy of Sciences. And the way it works is that you have a smartphone app and you can take a photo of a plant or an animal and upload it to a sort of a social network. And other people who know your area and know certain plant and animal species will review the image and give species identifications for that image. And when there's enough of a consensus about the correct species in the image, that observation will get upgraded to research grade status. And then the image and the label can be used for scientific research. So it's a really cool project that combines sort of community engagement and education with scientific data collection that is useful for ecology. And so we worked with the iNaturalist people to build this data set called iNat 2021. And so this data set has 10,000 categories, and each category is a species of plant or animal. And so we have 2.7 million training images, 50K val, 500K test. And so like ImageNet, it's an image classification data set, but the categories, instead of being everyday objects, are different plant and animal species. And so we want to, we have our 4 different data sets. We know how we're going to look at self-supervised learning across domains. And now, what questions do we want to ask about self-supervised learning? And so we wanted to ground our research in the questions that domain experts would want to have answered before they decide to use self-supervised learning for their research. So one example is data set size, knowing how many images you need for pre-training, how many images you need for the labeled stage, the fine-tuning. The second is the data domain. Does it matter if you do self-supervised learning on images that are similar to but not identical to your domain? Or what if you do self-supervised learning on images from a different domain? Would you expect performance to still be good? The third one is data quality. For instance, in medical imaging, you often have variable image quality where the imaging conditions can be a problem. So some images may be dark, or some images may be blurry, or things like this. And so what happens if you do self-supervised learning on images of imperfect quality? And finally, task granularity. So we're interested in this fine-grained classification task because in conservation, we often want to distinguish between categories like different species. And so it's important to know whether self-supervised learning results in features that can be used to distinguish between fine-grained categories. So we study all these aspects in the paper. For the talk, we're just going to focus on these 2, data set size and task granularity. And so we're focusing just on SimCLR, but there are many other self-supervised learning methods. But we've replicated these results on a number of them. And so we do feel that many of them are general observations. And second, the caveat is that we're going to focus on image classification, so no segmentation or detection. So first, the first question we're going to consider is, how much labeled and unlabeled data do I need? And it's important to know about labeled data because, as we discussed earlier, labels are expensive. And this is especially true for expertise-driven domains, where you can't just get anyone off the street to label this data. You need someone who's an expert in butterflies or someone who's an expert in frogs. The unlabeled data matters as well for a different reason, which is that the more unlabeled data you have, the more expensive it is to do the self-supervised learning pre-training stage. You have to train the methods for longer to get them to work well. And so we often think of unlabeled data as being free in computer vision, but it's not, because it actually drives up your computation budget. And so for someone who's an ecologist who wants to use these methods, it's important to consider both the computational cost from the unlabeled data as well as the annotation cost from the labeled data. So first we'll talk about unlabeled data. So we're looking at a plot here where on the y-axis, we have the change in top 1 accuracy as a function of the change in the number of pre-training images. So on this first point, what we're saying is, okay, if we double the size of the pre-training set from 125,000 to 250,000 images, how much does that increase the accuracy of the resulting classifier? So here's what these curves look like for ImageNet and iNat 21. And so we can see that doubling the amount of pre-training data early on from 125 to 250K leads to pretty big boosts in performance. 6 to 8% is a significant performance increase. Doubling again gets us around 2 to 3% performance. Doubling again gets us under 2% performance marginally. So one way to look at this is that we can actually cut the computation cost in half and lose less than 2% accuracy, which in many domains is actually a pretty good deal.
Quick question, Ledger.
Yes.
These are evaluated on the corresponding test set, or are they evaluated on iNat?
these are evaluated on the corresponding test set. So we're training on ImageNet, testing on ImageNet, training on INET, testing on INET.
Good, thanks.
So we've talked about unlabeled data, but how about labeled data? What does that landscape look like? So we're going to look at a similar plot, but on the x-axis here, we just have the number of labeled images we're going to use for training. And on the y-axis, we're looking at what percentage of fully supervised performance we attain. And so for all of these, we were pre-training on 1 million images to start, and then we're training a classifier on top of that, pre-trained feature extractor, and looking at how performance increases as we add more labeled data to the supervised stage. And so by percent supervised performance, what we mean is that we're defining 1.0 here to be the performance of an end-to-end algorithm that is trained in a supervised way on 10 to the 6 images. And so this is the performance we would hope to be able to attain. You know, this is the kind of upper limit if we have a bunch of labeled data, how well you do. And we're going to arbitrarily say that, you know, okay, look, getting to 80% of fully supervised performance, we're going to call that good performance. So we'd like to get into this green band, and the question is, how many labeled images do you need to get into the green band? So here's the curve for ImageNet. And so for ImageNet, what we see is that you actually still need over 100,000 labeled images to reach the green band, where you have 80% of fully supervised performance. And for INAT 21, actually, even 1 million images is not enough to get you into that band. And so even though the point of self-supervised learning is to be able to learn classifiers with fewer labels, but I think we're still not quite there yet. And the other thing to remember is if you call back to the unsupervised learning results, we see this gap between INAT 21 with 1 million images and where we would like to be with supervised performance. And that gap is on the order of 20–25%. And so more pre-training data is not going to close that gap, right? Because we've already seen that doubling your pre-training set size to 1 million images is only netting you less than 2% performance. So you'd have to expand your training set, vastly to your pre-training set quite a bit to be able to, get to the performance level we'd like to have. And so the conclusions here are that self-supervised learning does seem to approach supervised performance, which is the conclusion the field reached based on ImageNet. But that's true on ImageNet and not on INAT 21. And it also requires 100,000 to 1 million labels for classifier training after the self-supervised learning stage. And so these are kind of core computer vision and machine learning insights that have been revealed by looking at a new benchmark and taking an analysis that's grounded in these kind of real-world objectives. And so the hope for this is to be able to provide empirical reasons for the field to sort of refocus its attention on different aspects of self-supervised learning, instead of just focusing on ImageNet and just focusing on performance with lots of labeled data after self-supervised training. So we'll turn now briefly to the task granularity aspect. And so in task granularity, we say, okay, before I use this, I need to know, does self-supervised learning work well for fine-grained classification? And so by fine-grained classification, what we mean is that we have categories that can be extremely visually similar, like, for instance, these two species of moth. And so we're going to look at a plot that shows performance, top-line accuracy, as a function of granularity. And so on the left side here, we have coarse-grained categories like kingdom, and on the right side, we have fine-grained categories like species. And because we're looking at INAT 21, we have this great hierarchy, which is based on the biological tree of life. And so the protocol here is that we're going to train our classifiers on the finest level of labels, the species labels, and we're going to evaluate at progressively coarser levels of the taxonomy by pooling the predictions and the labels up to higher levels. So we're not retraining the algorithms at every level of granularity. We're training at the finest level of granularity, and we're evaluating across the taxonomy. And so here are some curves. The black curve is fully supervised performance. This is end-to-end pre-training from scratch on the full INAT 21 dataset. And the colored curves here are two different self-supervised methods. And so the first thing we notice is that the gap between supervised and self-supervised performance is about 4 times larger for INAT 21 than it is for ImageNet. The second thing we notice is that For coarse-grained categories, as we pool the predictions and labels up to these coarse levels like class and phylum, self-supervised performance is actually pretty close to supervised. So you can recover the results that we concluded from ImageNet if you make the categories coarse enough. And so the level at which self-supervised learning is performing similar to supervised learning is class. And so an example of a biological class is aves, which is all the birds, or insecta, which is all the insects. And so these are similar to the kinds of categories you might find in ImageNet. And then we see that the gap grows as the evaluation is made more fine-grained. And so we seem to be observing that self-supervised learning is struggling unduly on this fine-grained classification problem. And so we might want to know why. And so one way to investigate this is to inspect the features that have been learned by the different methods. And so what we're going to do is some nearest neighbor lookups. So this image here on the left is going to be our query. And we're going to say, okay, if we do self-supervised learning, what are the 10 nearest neighbors for this image? And if we do supervised learning, what are the 10 nearest neighbors for this image? And so this is for the supervised feature extractor, and these are the nearest neighbors for the query image on the left. The blue frames are for the correct species, and the red frames indicate that it's the incorrect species. But even so, these neighbors are pretty reasonable, right? So as a non-expert, I think many of these are very reasonable mistakes. Like, look at this bird, right? It has a lot of similarity with the query bird, as does this one. And we see a lot of variation in viewpoint. So these strike me as pretty good results, where all the nearest neighbors are either the right species or they're reasonable mistakes. For self-supervised learning, we see something pretty different, which is that every single one of the nearest neighbors is a bird on somebody's hand, right? So the actual focal object, the bird, has been almost completely ignored. And instead, what we seem to be learning is sort of the overall scene structure. And so it's easy to see then how the self-supervised learning methods are underperforming on fine-grained classification tasks if they're just learning overall scene structure. But in many cases, like ImageNet, you can see how that would actually be fine. If you need to tell the difference between a bus and a basketball, overall scene structure will probably deliver for you. And so self-supervised learning seems to be able to pull out coarse visual similarity. And on ImageNet, that suffices. Self-supervised learning matches supervised performance. This was the mainstream knowledge in the field. And we've been able to show that on IAT21, there's actually a pretty big gap here. And there's a compelling reason to wonder what the capabilities are of self-supervised methods for these fine-grained tasks. And so this is an example where we've been able to extract new lessons for machine learning by taking an application-grounded look at self-supervised learning algorithms. And what's clear is that while we don't yet have a good tool for domain experts based on self-supervised learning, we know what we need to work on. We need to work on low shot, and we need to work on fine-grained self-supervised learning. And this is, the hope is that by showing these results in a very compelling way, we can direct more of the field's attention towards these problems. And so we're working on these problems internally in the lab, but there's still ongoing projects. So this is the end of the little self-supervised learning chapter. So I'll pause for questions here if anyone wants to discuss anything.
I have a question. So do you think contrastive training, contrastive learning objective is sort of the way to go? Or will there be other objectives that will sort of...
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. So in contrastive learning, right, we're taking the images, we're looking at different views of the image, and we're putting them together, pushing them apart, depending on whether they came from the same parent image. But there are other self-supervised paradigms, right, like BYOL, where you are doing the sort of self-distillation approach is kind of fundamentally different. But we've been able to replicate these results on non-contrastive objectives. So BYOL, for instance, has the same issues. So we don't think it's specific to contrastive, but I happen to think that recent work on masked autoencoders is promising. And so we have an ongoing project in the lab right now to evaluate whether masked autoencoders do better in fine-grained tasks. And the hope is that with these autoencoders, because you're actually doing pixel level reconstruction of the image, that it will focus more on the fine detail you need to succeed in fine-grained classification. So the answer is, it doesn't seem to be specific to contrastive learning, but I think there's reason to be optimistic about masked autoencoders and some of these other recent methods.
Thanks.
So we talked about self-supervised learning, which is one way of getting away with less labeled data. But the other thing you can do is you can think about supervised learning from imperfect data, which is often fairly abundant. So the context we're going to talk about is multi-label classification. And in this task, we want to predict every relevant label for this image. And so, for instance, maybe we have truck, tree, and fence, and these are the labels that apply to this image. So instead, this is in contrast to multi-class classification, where every image has only one label. In multi-label image and multi-label classification, we can apply any subset of the labels that are relevant. And so the ground truth vector looks something like this, where you have these orange circles that indicate negative labels, the blue circles that indicate positive labels. And so we say, okay, we have a truck, tree, and a fence, but there's no bike. But the problem is that this multi-label annotation is extremely expensive, because for every category of interest, you have to either affirm or reject its presence. And so we'd like to be able to train multi-label classifiers with less labeled data. And so in this work, we decided to see how far you could push that. And we wanted to know whether it was possible to train multi-label classifiers using only one positive label for every image. And so this is sort of a new setting that we defined and built out the benchmarks for to sort of play this game of seeing how low you can go with multi-label classification. And so the actual observed labels you get are the one positive label, and all of these other labels are unobserved. You don't know that they're negatives. You just know that you don't have them. And so the simplest method for addressing this problem is to say, okay, well, we're just going to use a standard loss function, but we're going to assume that any of our unobserved labels are in fact negative labels. So if the ground truth vector looks like this, and the observed labels look like this, where you have one positive label observed and the rest of them are unobserved, then the train targets you're going to use look like this, where you have your one positive label and everything else is negative. And then we use a standard binary cross entropy loss to train. And so most of the time, you're going to be right, actually, with this method. So this is a nice, simple baseline, which tends to work well because in many multi-label contexts, the positive labels are sparse, right? You don't have an image that has 90% of your categories of interest. You have an image that has 2% of your categories of interest, right? A handful. So the most of the time, if you assume unobserved labels are negative, you're going to be right. But there will be a few of these cases where you have unobserved positives. And in those cases, you're going to be making mistakes, and that's going to be messing up your classifier training. And so a simple way to improve this baseline is to assume the unobserved labels are negative and to add label smoothing. And so label smoothing is a simple trick where you take your normal target distribution and you take a convex combination between your actual labels and the uniform distribution. That's mediated by this parameter epsilon. It's often set to 0.1 or something like that. And so you're just smoothing out the distribution a little bit, and you're reducing the penalty for these unobserved positives. And this has been shown in the multi-class classification literature to reduce sensitivity to label noise. And so in this case, this is a slightly stronger baseline than assuming negative, because you're taking a step to correct for the mistakes you're making, these unobserved positive labels. And so we can go one step further, and we introduced this method called regularized online label estimation. So the idea here is to achieve two goals. One is we want to let the algorithm guess what the unobserved labels ought to be. We want basically to allow it to make up its own labels when the labels are unobserved. We want to make sure that those guesses are consistent with what we know about the problem. And so the way we set this up is first with a standard image classifier. So we have an image xn that goes through f, our image classifier, and comes up with some predictions. We have a second module, which we call the label estimator, whose job it is to remember the current belief about the labels for image n. So it takes in the index of this image. So xn goes into f, and this is the image classifier. Then we just take the index of that image, and we look up through g whatever the current belief is about the labels for image n. So we can talk about the implementation of this later if people are interested. So we have the predictions from image classifier, and then we have the estimated labels from the label estimator G. And so as we build up the loss, the first thing we want to do is make sure that for the observed positive label we do have, we want to make sure we predict that correctly. And so we just use a standard log loss here and say, okay, look, the predictions should respect the observed positive label we do have. For unobserved labels, we're going to use the output of G as the ground truth. And then again, do a standard binary cross entropy on that. And then finally, we're going to introduce this parameter K, which is the expected number of positive labels per batch. And so this is something that you may know from prior knowledge or that you may estimate as a hyperparameter. But what it means is that you'd say, okay, on average, I think there are 2.5 categories that appear per image as an average over the entire data set. And then we simply penalize deviations at the batch level from that prior knowledge. So this is what prevents us from predicting an unreasonable number of positive labels per batch. Then we symmetrize this loss over G, and we train F and G simultaneously in an end-to-end way. I'll pause here if there are any questions about this. Okay. And so, the way to think about this is that we're basically treating the unobserved labels as latent variables, and we're estimating them online during training. So the algorithm gets to guess its own labels and correct them during training. And so what happens to those unobserved labels during training? Because remember, we have the observed positive, then we have our unobserved positives. We want to know how are those behaving throughout the course of training. When we use this assume negative loss, where we take all the unobserved labels and we treat them as if they were negatives, what we're looking at here is the distribution of the predictions for unobserved positives. And we can see that it tends to concentrate around 0, which is what you'd expect, right? For these unobserved positive labels, if you're telling the algorithm that those are zeros, it's going to learn to predict them as zeros. And so that's why we get this yellow band along the bottom. Ideally, we'd like them all to be ones, right? Because these are unobserved positives, but this assumed negative loss is really pushing them down to 0. When we use our roll method, we do see that we're able to recapture a significant fraction of the unobserved positive labels. So throughout the course of training, the distribution of the predictions for these unobserved positives actually tends to concentrate close to 1. So we're able to recover the unobserved labels during training. In terms of quantitative metrics, on the y-axis here, we have the mean average precision, which is the standard metric for multi-label classification. And on the x-axis, we have the number of observed labels that we're using for training. And so this is the upper bound. This is the fully supervised case where we're adding more images as we go along the curve, and each image brings with it 20 labels. This is the fully observed case. And we're using the Pascal data set, so there's 20 categories. And so every image brings with it 20 labels. And so we're subsampling here 10%, 20%, all the way up to 100% of the images in the data set. This is the result for the assumed negative loss. So here we have 1 label per image, and we're using the assumed negative loss to train. And this is how we perform as we add more images to the data set. And then we can add in assume negative with label smoothing, which is this orange curve, and roll, which is the green curve. So we can make a few observations here. First is that it's possible to approach fully supervised performance using more than 10 times fewer labels, which is great. Right, in a lot of cases, we'd like to be able to train good multi-label classifiers without having to collect all that data. And so this is indicating that that should actually be possible. The second thing is that if you have a fixed label budget, it's actually much better to spend those labels doing single positive multi-label annotation than it is to exhaustively annotate a smaller number of images. So these are nice sort of practical insights for collecting multi-label data sets and training multi-label classifiers. And so this is the single positive multi-label setting we introduced is actually gaining some traction. And so there's other research groups that are publishing papers on it in kind of our recent conferences, which has been very fun to see. But it's fair to ask, this seems like a fairly contrived problem. Why is this something we're interested in? So we'll talk briefly about places that we're actually deploying these ideas in practice.
Could I just ask a question before moving on?
Mm-hmm.
So it's related to this slide. So it's evaluated on VOC. So that's an object detection data set, right?
Correct.
So I was just curious. The one positive that you used per image, was that randomly selected or something like that?
That's right. So for this paper, we use 4 data sets, all of which are multi-label classification data sets that have complete labels. And so to simulate this single positive case, we take 1 positive label per image uniformly at random, and we treat the rest of them as unobserved. And so we just do this offline once. And so, you might ask the question like, okay, you're picking 1 positive label at random. Is that really representative of how you might have missingness in this data? And the answer is, of course, no, not at all.
Yeah, exactly. So I was thinking, like, for example, in object detection, you could maybe have used a higher probability of keeping large objects or something like that, because I suspect that a person would more likely annotate the most obvious object in image or something like that.
Yeah, it's a great idea. I actually have an undergrad who's working on this now, who just had something accepted on it, where he looked at a few different biases. So one is object size bias, like you're talking about, so that larger objects are more likely to be selected, but also objects that are closer to the middle, objects that are rarer, objects that are more frequent. And so we actually have some work that's coming out soon that studies the effect of this label selection bias on SPML performance.
Okay, thanks. Very interesting.
Yeah. And so this sort of data, this positive only data, tends to show up in a lot of important domains. So one example is our collaboration with UCSF School of Medicine, where we're working on representation learning for retinal images. But in terms of annotations, often you have an image and what kind of one condition they do have because they showed up to the clinic for some kind of reason. But typically you don't have absence data for all these other conditions that they may or may not have. And so this is a case where you'd like to use positive only annotations to learn representations. Another example is in sustainability, where for a naturalist, they collect all of these images. The images are identified as to the species level. And then we have a bunch of points where we've observed species to be present. And we'd like to be able to model the distribution of a species, right? So that we know, is this population growing? Is it shrinking? Where does it live? But we don't, we have these points where we know that, say, a northern mockingbird is present, but we have no idea whether other species are present or absent. And so this is another case where if you wanted to train models for species distribution prediction, you need to be able to use these single positive annotations. And so we're working on this right now with the iNaturalist folks, where we're building out large-scale geospatial models that use single positive labels to train these species distribution classifiers. And so we've seen sort of new benchmarks, new algorithms, and new research questions, all of which emerge from taking a close look at important domain-specific questions and understanding, okay, what is the reason these aren't solved, and what do we need to do as computer scientists to make these our algorithms work better for these different use cases. And we focused on kind of one area here where we've talked about limited and imperfect data and what you should do with it. But there's lots of other areas where we can ask these questions, and so I want to zoom out briefly and emphasize a few broader points. So one is that there's a nice middle ground. There's a lot of problems in this middle ground where you can do machine learning research that is fundamental and also have a significant direct impact on an application area. And so, for instance, we have some work showing that if you have spatiotemporal metadata, you have images and you know where the image was taken and when, you can use that to get up to 20% higher accuracy on image classification for fine-grained tasks. We have other work showing that if you have hierarchy information, right, if you know the image and you know the category, and you actually know how different categories are related, that you can do object localization with up to 15 times fewer labels. And these are both projects that I want to emphasize are sort of algorithm independent. You don't need to overfit to the problems of a very particular use case to build things that work well. And so by algorithm independent, what I mean is that the method we use on the left here for spatiotemporal data is compatible with any image classifier. And the method we use on the right for localization is compatible with any object localization algorithm. And so you can build, I wouldn't have time to go into the details, but it is possible to strike this middle ground between doing something that's so general that it's not ready for applications and something that's so specific that there's no general principle you can learn from it. And so currently we're working with iNaturalist to deploy our geospatial models to help them improve their image classifiers. I'm working with Oisin McKay on that project right now. And from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, it has a new app out called Merlin that does bird sound ID from audio. And this is an example of a single positive multi-label case that has kind of recently come online and is very exciting. And the single positive multi-label thing here is that if you go outside and you record some audio, you're always going to be hearing multiple birds, but you may only have one bird that's identified in that audio. And so often you're training these in a single positive multi-label way. Another thing I want to emphasize is that these kind of impact-aligned benchmarks are very important because they make it easy for mainstream machine learning researchers to work on these problems. So for instance, there's a very challenging problem called species distribution modeling, which I've alluded to before. And there's a variant of it that's very cutting edge, where instead of using sort of traditional environmental features like altitude and temperature, you're actually using satellite imagery to try to predict the presence or absence of different plant and animal species. And so working with some colleagues at INRIA, we developed some data sets and competitions that take this problem, which is pretty, it's tricky, the data processing is complicated, and we package it up nicely and make it easy for machine learning people to work on it. So this is the GeoLife Clay competition series. And I mentioned this paper before, but we're working on scaling up species distribution modeling to 47,000 species worldwide. And we're also building this into a nice benchmark so that it's easy for machine learning people to work on distribution modeling, which is a kind of a core problem in ecology these days. And also we have a new evaluation set out for self-supervised learning, where instead of just focusing on species classification, we have this suite of low-shot binary tasks where you might want to know, here's an image, is there one animal or two? Are they mating or not? Is a hummingbird at a flower or is it not at a flower? A bunch of these sort of ecologically relevant binary classification tasks, which go beyond species classification. And so here we're building benchmarks for self-supervised learning that are more closely aligned to the tasks that ecologists actually want to solve. And I also think it's important to kind of build out community structure to help solve these problems. And so one example is the FGVC workshop, which I helped to co-organize. I should have removed the submission deadline. That was in the future the last time I gave this talk. But it's a really great workshop that runs competitions where basically domain experts work with machine learning researchers to build data sets and benchmarks and run competitions on different problems like product recognition or matching images to news headlines or fungus identification. And it's a really great forum where machine learning researchers and domain experts come together to collaborate on these real world problems. And we can also go the other way and start to train domain experts in some AI knowledge. And so I'm an instructor for this Resnick Sustainability Institute summer workshop on computer vision methods for ecology, which I highly recommend. It's for professional ecologists who want to learn how to build computer vision prototypes for their research. And so, it's a great experience where it's a 3-week in-person experience at Caltech. And so definitely check it out and apply if you are someone from an ecology background who wants to learn how to build vision prototypes for your research. And I also want to emphasize just that these real-world problems tend to reveal new AI research questions. It's not just about building systems that are bespoke solutions to specific problems. There's a lot we can learn about our field of machine learning. And so, for instance, discovering that fine-grained self-supervised learning is a major limitation right now. The single positive multi-label setting, or these large-scale joint implicit neural representations, which are the kind of the background technology for the species distribution work that I didn't talk about. And so in the future, I think we need to consider these. Looking through the lens of these applications, it's clear that we need to figure out better how to control the granularity of our representations, and generally understanding, instead of just throwing all of our data into a bucket, running the algorithm and seeing what pops out, we need some levers to be able to control what kinds of things are being captured if we want these self-supervised methods to be useful for these kind of expertise-driven domains. I also expect sort of representation learning for space and time to be a big topic going forward. Because there's so many domains like biodiversity and epidemiology and economics, all of whom need good geospatial features to make predictions. But geospatial data is such a huge pain to pull together and curate. And so I think, geospatial data still needs to have its ImageNet moment where there's really good off-the-shelf feature extractors for space and time that you can use for a variety of downstream tasks. And I also think we need to, think about whether data sets are still the right object to be considering. So if you think of a case like iNaturalist, it's not really a data set, it's more of a data stream where you have this vast incoming stream of raw data. You have context, like where the photo was taken, you have these weak labels, and you have a limited ability to query experts about your images. And so thinking about how should we do machine learning in cases where you have this kind of continual, stream of data that's kind of weakly associated with each other, instead of having an offline set of data with flawless, perfect labels, is I think a really interesting research area going forward. So I just want to briefly thank the iNaturalist community who makes all this work possible with their great data collection, and collaborators at Caltech and industry collaborators at Microsoft and Google, and the folks at INRIA. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Elijah. Do we have some questions from the audience?
Yes, may I ask a question? Thank you for your presentation. I have a question about self-supervised learning you mentioned. You showed us 3 different type of methodology, like rotation and filling the blanks, and another one. But I didn't get if you're doing or you're defining this task for the same network that you're working on, or for another one, because if your network is going to classify something, then you're asking it for guess the rotation angle. This is another task, or for filling the blank, it's like a generative models.
Yeah, so the question is, what is so there's these different self-supervised learning methods are primarily defined by what we call the pretext task. So this is the filling in the blank or predicting the rotation. And in general, you can use any architecture. So you have this feature extractor component, and then there's like a head at the end, and that head will be specialized to the different tasks, but the feature extractor will be the same. And so you can do the rotation prediction thing, and then throw away the rotation predictor and put a new head on there that can be used for segmentation or detection.
Oh, got it.
Not a strong connection between the architecture and the pretext task for self-supervised learning.
I got it now. Thank you.
May I ask, you also mentioned for geographical investigations, you had RGB topography. What were the 2 other things you mentioned?
I'm sorry, could you say the question one more time?
Yes, you showed that you could improve the Earth observation data by adding RGB topography, and there were 2 other features you also.
I mean here?
Yes, land cover, yes, and
Yeah, so this is RGB imagery, so just regular optical. This is near infrared. Then we have altitude here in land cover, and so the land cover categories they're different things like this is cropland, or this is industrial areas, or things like that.
or you can also say land cover, land use. I mean, sort of. Yeah. Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So thank you, Elijah, for this talk. We've learned a lot of interesting things, and I really like this this view of sort of trying to get things to be closer to sort of the end task. I think also your thoughts about data streams and sort of how do we connect things there. We're going with sort of active learning, or what what are we doing there? So looking forward to what comes out from you and your group in the future.
Thank you.
Next week, we have another presentation, and it's going to be language. We have Rico Sandrich from University of Zurich. He's going to talk about knowledge transfer across languages and modalities. So welcome then in April 20th. And thank you all for today.
Thanks, everyone.